Have you ever trusted a life to someone only to find your name missing from the last page? The lawyer cleared his throat and the room tilted. I sat very still. My fingers folded the handkerchief again and again, the pattern worn soft from years. He read in a voice that was kind and careful. The kind of voice trained to make unpleasant things ordinary. My name did not come up where I had believed it would. Pages rustled like small birds. The words felt like cold paper pressed to my chest. Years of Sunday dinners, of mended sleeves and late-night rides to the ER, felt unpaid in a single, empty line. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. Someone coughed. My breath caught. I remember thinking how ordinary our life had been, how steady, how unremarkable. And then, a sentence in ink redefined it. He said, almost gently, that there was a reason, not accidental, a decision. I heard the word and my throat closed around it. My hands trembled, and the house seemed suddenly very large. When the lawyer said the reason, my breath stopped and the chair under me felt strange and empty. Sometimes the loudest betrayal is the one written in ink. Hello, I'm Evelyn Hart. Sit with me a minute. This isn't a tale to fan old flames. It's a lesson about worth, promises, and the small duties that stitch a life together. If you've ever been surprised or left out by family decisions, please like and subscribe. Share it with a friend who needs a quiet reminder they're not alone. I'll tell this plainly, no gossip, just truth. Pour a cup of tea, put a quilt across your knees. Listen with me to how a single sentence on a page can change a life, and how dignity might be restored with patience and clear steps. Stay until the end. I'll share the small practical thing I did that helped me reclaim my voice today. So let me tell you why a will, a lawyer, and one missing name changed everything. Morning comes the same way it always does, softly, with the sigh of the kettle and the smell of toast catching just at the edges. The house wakes slow, like it knows it's supposed to stay quiet until I'm ready. I stand by the window and watch the light spill across the kitchen table. The wood is old but polished smooth, like it remembers every breakfast we ever shared. On one side sits my teacup, on the other, still, a placemat that hasn't been used in years. I can't quite bring myself to remove it. The clock above the stove ticks faithfully, its steady rhythm filling the spaces that conversation used to live in. I hum along with it sometimes, old hymns, bits of lullabies. It's a way to make the house feel less empty. Or maybe it's a way to remind myself I'm still here. Every morning, I start the same. Water the begonias, feed the cat, check the mailbox. It's my way of keeping order in a world that doesn't ask much of me anymore. Outside, the air still has that early chill of spring. The sun is bright but not yet warm. My porch steps creak the same 3 notes every time I walk down them. I pin the small red, white, and blue ribbon to the railing, the same one I put up every May for Memorial Day, a habit Thomas started years ago when he said, "A flag's not a decoration, Evie, it's a thank you." That ribbon flutters in the breeze now, a little faded at the edges, but I keep it anyway. It feels like something he'd notice, something he'd smile at. Back inside, the radio hums low, the old station that still plays Sinatra in the mornings. I pour myself another cup of tea and glance at the photo on the mantel. Thomas, younger, strong, standing beside his first pickup truck. I can almost hear his voice, steady, practical, certain, the kind of voice that made promises sound like facts. He'd always say, "Life isn't complicated if you keep your word." That used to comfort me. Now it feels like an echo that won't settle. I reach for the mail. Most of it is the usual catalogs, a church newsletter, a flyer about a local fundraiser, but one envelope stands out, cream-colored, heavier than the rest. My name typed in neat, professional letters. The return address reads, Harper and Stanton, Attorneys at Law. For a moment, I just hold it. The paper feels cool against my palm. I can smell ink, sharp and sterile. I set it on the table next to my teacup and just look at it. I tell myself it's routine, maybe something about taxes or insurance, but there's a knot forming behind my ribs that says otherwise. I finish my tea, I wash the cup, I watered the ferns, all while pretending not to see the envelope sitting there, waiting. Finally, I sit down. The chair creaks softly as I slide my finger under the seal. The flap opens with a side dot inside a letter printed on crisp stationery. My eyes go first to the bold line halfway down. You are cordially invited to the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas E. Hart. My stomach drops. The air around me feels suddenly heavier. I read it again, slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something softer, but they don't. The reading is scheduled for Friday morning, 11 o'clock. There's a line that says, "All parties named within the will are requested to attend." All parties named. I read that part twice. My name isn't in that sentence, not yet, not on the page. But the phrase has a chill to it, like a door only some people are allowed to walk through. I fold the letter neatly, smoothing the edges as if that will help me breathe. Then I look again at Thomas's photo. I studied the eyes I used to know by heart, the small creases at their corners that only appeared when he was truly at peace. "Thomas," I say softly, the sound almost swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator. "What did you do?" The house offers no answer, only the slow tick of the clock and the faint rustle of leaves outside. I keep thinking how ordinary this morning was supposed to be: toast, ribbon, begonias, the safe rhythm of a widow's day. But now, there's a strange electricity in the air, like something in my quiet world has been rearranged while I wasn't looking. The letter lies there, heavy with the weight of everything it doesn't say. I pour another cup of tea I don't drink. The taste of metal lingers in my mouth. Fear, disbelief, maybe both. The house hums with small comforts, the hiss of the kettle, the tap of the spoon, until that single envelope turns it into a place of questions. And later, when the lawyer's voice read Thomas's will aloud, and my name didn't come, the room filled with a quiet I couldn't name. Thomas used to say, "Words are paper until you live by them." I was raised in a house where promises were treated like currency. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had plenty of names people could call on. My father worked at the mill and came home with grease on his hands and a quiet sense that things could be repaired if you had the patience to try. My mother ironed shirts for neighbors and kept a jar of sugar under the counter for any knock on the door. Hospitality was not a performance in our family. It was a duty you practiced each day in small gestures. From an early age, I learned that words mattered. My father would say, "Evie, a man's word is what he'll be remembered for." And he wasn't talking about speeches or bills paid. He was talking about being the kind of person who shows up when somebody needs a chair moved, or a child watched, or a roof patched. That steadiness sank into me, like good stock reduces into soup, flavor and substance you notice most when it's missing. I met Thomas at 22, at a church picnic by the river, and he had the same practical step. He wasn't flashy. He had a slow, respectful laugh, and hands that looked like they had learned to carry things carefully. He introduced himself with a clumsy compliment about my pie, and, within months, we were arranging a life together with a kind of deliberate thrift. He wanted to build a company that would last, a family that would keep the same quiet rhythm, and he was good at the small things, showing up for meetings, saying sorry when he should, promising, and then keeping his word. We married, and the house filled with work. The children came. The porch swing creaked in hot weather, and there were summers of lemonade and lawnmowers. We made our promises in little ways, teaching our kids to say thank you, to add a few dollars to a college fund, to keep receipts for the day when counting matters. He would say, "Words mean nothing if you don't live by them." And we'd nod and put another can of beans into the pantry. I kept the books for his business. It wasn't glamorous: invoices, sticky notes, late-night phone calls, but keeping those ledgers meant I knew exactly where we stood. I learned to be careful about what I trusted to memory. Memory is a lovely thing, but a ledger keeps the facts when feelings get foggy. When something needed to be mended in the house or the company, we mended it together. A repair here, a quiet apology there. It felt like a partnership in the truest sense. As years passed, the steady habits became scaffolding for our days. The community knew us as dependable. The house with the bright mailbox, the family that brought pies when someone was sick, the man who volunteered to coach Little League. People leaned on us, and we leaned back. That reciprocity defined our neighborhood and gave our lives a texture that felt unshakable. But beneath the visible routine, small changes crept in that are easy to miss. Thomas began to carry a deeper attention to paperwork, contracts, partners, decisions made after I had gone to bed. He'd come home and sit with the papers longer. "Just finishing this," he'd say, and the morning would pass without more. The silence in those hours felt like a closed door rather than a window. It's not that our life was dishonest, it was quieter than that. Distance is often polite. It comes as a series of omissions: a missed dinner, a quick phone call, a plan that no longer includes you. You assume, foolishly, those small slips will smooth themselves out. You trust the people you love to come back and explain. You trust that the ledger of your life will reflect what your heart believes. that trust is tender. It allows you to leave the oven on a low flame, to set 2 plates because you expect a second chair to be pulled up. You don't notice the day the ledger flips. No trumpet sounds. The balance merely tilts, and then, one morning, an envelope arrives and the old accounting looks foreign. When the will was read later, those tiny cracks snapped into a pattern you could finally name. The quiet that had been comfort turned into a silence that asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. I found myself tracing back years of ordinary days for an explanation and wondering. You don't notice the day the ledger flips until someone else counts the pages. Our life together had the look of steadiness. Neighbors would nod and say, "There goes that reliable family," and we would smile and keep mowing lawns. Thomas liked things in order. Trucks parked straight, tools cleaned, appointments noted. I liked a tidy kitchen and a calendar that told me who was coming for Sunday dinner. Those small patterns held us. I taught the children to set the table, fold napkins, and send thank you notes. We hosted barbecues where Thomas manned the grill, and I mixed salads and pies. People said we were a team, and for a long time that felt true. I kept ledgers in a worn notebook. Payments, bills, birthdays. It was a modest map, but it kept our life tidy and honest. When the first quiet changes arrived, they seemed innocent. He came home later some evenings. A phone call that used to include me suddenly became something he ended quickly. He would say, "Long meeting," and I would nod because I trusted that the next morning would bring an explanation. Often it did not. That slow shrinking of conversation is easy to explain away until it is not. The children grew and left for their own lives. Our house felt too big in winter, and I filled the rooms with church meetings and quilting circles to keep company. I know now that people do what they must to keep warm, to keep moving forward. But I also see the small omissions that build a gulf: a check left unsigned, a plan made without asking, a favor he gave to someone else that he had promised me he would not. The ledger stayed, but sometimes the entries shifted. I would find receipts in pockets I did not recognize. Small notes tucked into envelopes that suggested meetings I had not attended. It felt like watching a neighbor put up a new fence, a little higher than the one we shared. I kept busy because busyness is a good salve. But even busy people look up when the world shifts under their feet. You don't notice the exact day a fault line opens. It is not like a crack in a dam. It is like frost. It creeps, and then one morning the surface is different. The will, read, loud and formal, made that frost visible. What had once been assumed and private was cast in paper and public when my name did not appear where I thought it would. I felt small and exposed, like a chair removed from a room mid-meal. The absence raised questions about promises kept and promises unspoken. It suggested decisions, once safely shared within marriage, had been made in rooms where I was not present. This dissonance was not simply financial, it was personal. Those small slights, missed calls, passing comments, favors redistributed, were not dramatic. They were the polite erosion of the shared life we had built. While the quilts, pies, and mended shirts remained, the ledger of our marriage had quietly developed another column. I thought back to decades of small commitments. The time I drove his truck when the garage flooded. The summer I stayed up to finish a contract envelope so nothing missed the deadline. The nights I sat with sick children and called for medicine. I remembered neighbors who had lent tools and hands when storms came. Those acts were invisible currency in a small town. When I tried to ask Thomas gently about the changes, he would smile and say, "We'll talk later." Later became a season. The more I asked, the more he retreated into the papers on his desk. It was a quiet privacy, not necessarily malice, but it had the same consequence. Decisions accumulated like dust. I set the table because it felt right and because I still believed in partnership, even when the pages on the desk suggested otherwise, and quietly. My heart didn't break. It narrowed into one hard, sensible decision. The call came late, the kind that pulls you upright when sleep is still soft. The clinic voice on the line said, "He's been admitted. He asked for you. We need consent." I dressed with hands that didn't feel like mine and drove through a town lit by sleepy street lamps. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and reheated coffee. A nurse led me to a small room and handed a packet titled Medical Consent. Inside were forms, immediate treatment, life support preferences, and a line marked Power of Attorney. Paper can look petty next to a man breathing under a sheet, but that line held real weight. I sat beside him. He looked thin, eyes bright with discomfort. "Mom," he said softly, "I thought I could handle it. I'm sorry." That apology made the decision simple in one way and complicated in another. I wanted to help, but I did not want to sign away protections we might need. The nurse explained the choices. Initial here to allow emergency procedures. Check this to limit interventions. Sign this for temporary decision-making authority. The language was precise. My heart was not. I asked about duration, oversight, and documentation. She pledged daily updates and a review meeting. Details steadied me. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives. Some asked if I'd signed, others worried a parent might be asked to take on too much. The town's attention pressed in. I felt the glare of scrutiny that sometimes comes with small communities where everyone knows everyone. Still, the responsibility before me felt private and clear. Keep him safe, keep the family honest. I thought of years spent caregiving, bandaging knees, balancing checkbooks, running late-night errands for medicine. Those small duties felt like preparation. They did not replace legal counsel, but they gave me a moral compass and the confidence to insist on safeguards. I initialed the medical sections that allowed life-saving actions. I left financial authority untouched and insisted on a neutral trustee if money needed handling. I wrote terms for regular review and documentation, and the nurse made copies and placed them in the file. I did not sign everything. That was intentional. Stewardship, I decided, is different than surrender. After the paperwork was in order, relief followed like a practical exhale. It wasn't triumph. It was a resolution to act responsibly under pressure. I called a lawyer the next morning, scheduled an accounting review, and made a list of calls. Neighbors called in the evening. Mrs. Delgado suggested a lawyer she knew, and said simply, "Document everything." I promised I would. That night I folded the papers and tucked them into a folder labeled medical. The house looked the same from the street, but inside something had shifted. A signature had become a practical promise I would have to keep. When I set the folder by the kettle, I understood that sometimes the only way to honor a life is to carry its burdens until the person can again carry their own. Silence in a family often speaks louder than arguments. When the will reading ended, people filed out like a class dismissed. No one wanted to meet my eyes. I stood near the door, pretending to read the legal packet clutched in my hands. At home, the silence pressed down heavier than the paperwork. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's loaded. I started calling family, one by one. My daughter-in-law said she didn't know anything. My niece answered on speaker, her voice small but edged. "Aunt Evie, Uncle Thomas had reasons. He just never told anyone what they were." Reasons, such a thin word for something so heavy. I asked what she meant, but her tone shifted, cautious now. "I shouldn't say more," she murmured. "You know how private he was." Private, yes. But Thomas and I hadn't built our life on privacy. We built it on shared checkbooks and Sunday talks, and the kind of small honesty that keeps people close. Over the next few days, rumors started to seep in like water through a crack. Neighbors mentioned seeing Thomas at odd hours, stopping by the post office long after closing, meeting someone in the diner parking lot. A cousin said he'd heard Thomas was setting something up for the community. A scholarship, maybe. But whispers are like fog. They move quickly and hide what's true. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that a will is just paper and love can't be erased by ink. But my chest carried a different truth. I needed to know why, not for money, not even for fairness, but for peace. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the pile of old mail and receipts that had been sitting untouched since his passing. My hands hovered over them like a woman about to disturb ghosts. The first envelope held utility bills, neatly paid. The second, old church donation slips. Then, tucked inside a stack of insurance papers, a check stub addressed to someone I didn't recognize. The name was scrawled in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. A woman's name, not family, not business. The date was recent, 2 months before his death. My stomach tightened. I thought about calling the lawyer, but I stopped myself. Lawyers want documents, not feelings. Instead, I made tea, sat by the window, and looked at the attic door, the one place Thomas kept locked, the one room he'd always said was just storage. I finished my tea and climbed the stairs, the house creaking beneath my steps like it disapproved. When I pulled down the attic ladder, dust fell in soft clouds. The air was dry, still filled with the faint scent of cedar and something older. I found boxes stacked neatly, labeled in his handwriting, taxes, receipts, letters. The box labeled letters was lighter than the rest. I lifted the lid carefully. Inside were envelopes tied with twine, and one, separate, without a string. Its flap was open, its paper YELLOWED. And on the corner, where a return address should have been, were two unfamiliar initials, not his. I turned it over in my hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar to Dot. My breath caught as I unfolded it, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The first line read, "Thomas, I received your note. The trust is finalized. Thank you for keeping your promise." My heart thudded hard against my ribs. A trust, a promise, not to me, not to our family. So I went looking through boxes in the attic and found a letter with someone else's initials. Paper remembers when people forget. The letter trembled in my hands. The paper was thin, the ink faded, but its meaning pressed sharp as glass. The trust is finalized. I sat down right there on the attic floor, light from the single window catching on dust motes that spun like old memories. For a moment, I thought maybe it was nothing, some business note, a clerical thank you. But then I saw the signature, RM, the initials from the envelope. I didn't know anyone by those letters, not in his business, not in our church. I gathered the letter and the box and brought them downstairs. My hands shook as I laid the contents across the table. Receipts, bank slips, small notebooks, and one stack of canceled checks, each addressed to the same name as the letter's signature, RM, all dated over 3 years. The handwriting was his. The amounts, not large, but steady enough to matter, enough to mean something personal. I felt the air go thin. Paper remembers, I said aloud to the quiet house. Paper keeps score. The next morning, I drove to the lawyer's office. I asked directly, "Who is RM?" He paused, just long enough to confirm that he knew. "A friend of Mr. Hart's," he said. "A beneficiary in a secondary trust arrangement." I stared at him. A friend, his professional smile didn't change. "A long-standing arrangement," he clarified. "Nothing illegal, Mrs. Hart, just private. Again with that word. When I got home, I called my husband's cousin, the one who handled some of the business paperwork for the foundation. His voice went tight. "Evie, let it rest," he said. "Thomas had a deal he couldn't undo. It wasn't about you. Not about me." I hung up. My dignity wanted to end it there, but curiosity and pain pushed harder. That night, I looked up the foundation's registry. A small line item appeared near the bottom of a report. Hart RM Community Initiative Fund. There it was. A trust. Real, documented, and signed by my husband alone. That it wasn't betrayal in the romantic sense, but it was a kind of quiet rewriting of our marriage. The next day, I drove to the old office where Thomas's friend Carl still worked. They'd built the company together once. Carl looked older, softer, but his eyes dropped when I mentioned the fund. "You weren't supposed to see that, Evie," he said finally, almost whispering. "Then tell me what it is." He sighed. "It's complicated. Some debts, some promises. He didn't want you carrying it. Said you'd worry too much." I felt heat rush to my face. "He worried enough to write me out of a will." Carl looked pained. "He thought he was protecting you." Protecting me. That word always sounds kind until you realize it means controlling what you know. I thanked him, though my voice shook. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face like clarity. Paper remembers when people forget. And when I asked that family friend about it, he glanced away and said, "You weren't supposed to see that." Sometimes the truth comes wrapped in protection, and that protection can feel like betrayal. By the end of the week, the whispers had turned into headlines, at least in our little town's way of speaking. I heard my name at the grocery store before I even turned the aisle. "Poor thing," someone murmured, "didn't even know about the trust." The foundation, it turned out, had released a statement, something polite and bland about Thomas Hart's private contribution to community efforts. The paper called it the Hart Promise Fund. I called it the thing that erased me from the story of my own marriage. The lawyer requested another meeting, just to clarify assets. His office smelled faintly of lemon polish and new guilt. He explained that Thomas had set aside a portion of his estate for this fund years ago, and because of how it was structured, it legally bypassed me. "It wasn't malicious," he said carefully, "just structured. I wanted to laugh. I nodded, calm on the outside, but inside the word structured echoed like a slammed door. I walked out before my tears could make a spectacle. That night, I sat with the documents spread out on my table, tracing Thomas's handwriting on every signature line. He'd signed T.E. Hart in that same steady script he used on every birthday card. I whispered, "You could have told me." The next morning, I went to the bank. The teller, a kind young woman, confirmed that yes, A separate account had existed. Yes, it was tied to a charitable trust. And yes, my husband had been the only authorized signatory. She looked at me with polite pity. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hart." I thanked her, because what else do you do when courtesy is the only armor you have left? Later that week, the lawyer invited me to meet with the trustees. They were polite, professional, and uncomfortably careful with their words. One of them said, "Your husband was a man of vision." Another said, "He believed in community stewardship." Each sentence felt like a fence between me and the truth. Finally, one trustee, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward and said, "Sometimes people protect the ones they love by leaving them out of things that could hurt them." I smiled faintly, though my heart burned. "That's not protection," I said quietly. "That's rewriting the story." She looked away. That night, unable to sleep, I went through Thomas's closet. His clothes still smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave. I reached into his jacket pocket, the one he used for receipts and pens. My fingers brushed paper, an envelope, old, worn, sealed. I sat on the bed and opened it carefully. Inside, a single page in his handwriting. "Evie, if you're reading this, it means you found the trust. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. It was something I promised long before we were married. I never meant it as betrayal. Please believe that." The note shook in my hands. It wasn't an explanation. It was an echo. Then, late one night, I found an envelope tucked into Thomas's old jacket with a confession inside. "Deadlines are like gates. Step through them, and you keep a voice. Miss them, and you lose it." The next morning, I took the note to the lawyer. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice didn't. "What happens if I want to challenge this trust?" He hesitated. "You'd have to act quickly. Probate deadlines are strict. Once they close, the terms stand." "How long?" 10 days. 10 days. That was all the time left between questions and silence. I walked home through streets lined with early summer heat, my thoughts louder than the birds. At the kitchen table, I made a list: lawyer, bank, county office, and one old friend who might still remember how the trust began. I worked each day as if I were back running his company again, filing, calling, asking. Some doors opened, most did not. The bank handed me transaction histories, filled with dates and codes that looked like ciphers. I spread them across the table like puzzle pieces. I learned to read the fine print, to find meaning in every comma. The attorney warned me, "This kind of challenge can stir things up, Mrs. Hart." "Are you sure?" I nodded. "If a story is going to be told about my husband, I want the whole one." Every evening, I'd walk to the porch and sit under the ribbon, still fluttering in the warm wind. The flag's colors had deepened in the sun, and I thought of how even fabric wears its own history. I called the probate office. The clerk's voice was brisk but kind. "If you want to preserve your rights," she said, "you'll need to file intent to contest before the 10th day. After that, it's sealed." I hung up and looked at the calendar. 9 days left. I barely slept. Neighbors noticed my lights on late and brought over casseroles, thinking grief had turned to insomnia. I thanked them, but what kept me awake wasn't grief anymore. It was purpose. On the 9th day, I gathered everything: the will, the trust letter, the checks, the confession note, and went to the bank to have copies certified. The teller recognized my face from weeks prior. "Are you all right, Mrs. Hart?" she asked gently. I gave her a tired smile. "Sometimes doing the right thing looks like running out of time." She nodded, not understanding fully, but kind enough not to ask more. When she handed me the copies, she paused, glancing at one ledger entry. "Wait, this one's strange," she said. "What do you mean?" She pointed. "This transaction, it doesn't match the rest. Same fund, same account, but this time, the payment went out instead of in, and it's dated after the death certificate." My breath caught. "After?" She nodded. "Yes, the system logged a transfer 2 weeks ago, to a different account entirely." The paper shook in my hands. The ink looked recent, fresh. I thanked her, my voice thin, and stepped outside into the heavy summer heat. "Deadlines are like gates. Step through them and you keep a voice. Miss them and you lose it." I ran to the bank just in time, and the teller handed me a ledger entry that explained everything and nothing. The ledger the teller showed me was a map, not of money, but of meaning. The unfamiliar transactions were tied to a small parcel of land just outside of town. A number scrawled in the margin caught my eye: Lot 17B, County Line Road. That night I looked it up in the county records, my kitchen table covered in papers and half-drunk tea. The computer screen glowed against the dark window like a confession booth. The land had been transferred. years ago, not to a person, but to an organization. The Hart Veterans Trust. The name stopped me. Hart. My name, his name. I clicked through the scanned files. Heart pounding. Thomas had set it up quietly, no fanfare, no family mention. A trust that donated half the parcel's profits to a local veterans housing program. My hands trembled. The signature was unmistakably his, the witnesses to old business associates. I sat back and stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. All this time, I thought the missing name meant rejection. But what if it meant protection? What if he had written me out so I wouldn't be pulled into the legal mess of it all? A business venture that went bad, or debts that threatened the trust's purpose. I found one note at the bottom of a scanned document, in his careful handwriting. If anything happens, let this land do what I couldn't finish myself. A sound left me, half sob, half laugh. For the first time, the picture started to change. Maybe Thomas hadn't cut me out of spite. Maybe he'd been trying to clean up something messy, something meant to honor people he once served alongside. The next morning, I visited the small veterans center downtown. The man behind the desk looked at me curiously when I mentioned the trust. Mrs. Hart, we've heard your husband's name around here plenty. Helped fund part of the workshop wing. He led me down a hallway where hand-painted signs thanked donors. At the bottom, in plain letters, in memory of T.E. Hart, for those who serve quietly. The sight caught my breath. Thomas had done this quietly, privately, in his way. But as the warmth of discovery filled me, so did unease. If this trust had existed so long, why had no one mentioned it? The director handed me a copy of their records, neat ledgers, dates, signatures. I flipped through pages until I reached a recent entry, a transfer from the same account I had just found at the bank. Only this one was made after his death. Looked closer at the name of the person who approved it, not the lawyer, not a trustee I recognized, someone else entirely. The signature was unfamiliar, and the date, 2 weeks after the funeral. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. The truth had changed shape again. This wasn't just about charity or omission anymore. Someone else was moving money under his name. Close the ledger carefully. Sometimes the hardest truths make room for the clearest. Justice. But when I asked for the Veteran Trust's files, I found a ledger entry with an unfamiliar name and a date that didn't make sense. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and faint coffee. The air was thick with nerves and something heavier expectation. I sat in the front row, papers stacked neatly in my lap, hands folded over them like prayer. The trustee, Thomas's distant cousin, stood at the opposite table, his tie too tight, his voice too calm. He said the trust was legal, the will was clear, and the deceased's wishes must stand. He used phrases like fiduciary responsibility and intent preserved. But when it was my turn, I didn't speak in legal language. I spoke like a wife, like a woman who had shared a lifetime of ordinary trust. I told them about Thomas, how he believed in steady work, in giving quietly, in fixing what was broken even when no one thanked him for it. I laid down letters, ledgers, and receipts. I showed the letter he'd written me, the one tucked in his jacket pocket. And when the lawyer asked for witnesses, Ruth stepped forward, her calm as sharp as truth. Thomas Hart wasn't hiding money, she said clearly. He was fulfilling a promise, one to a veteran who saved his life overseas. The foundation wasn't secrecy, it was gratitude. The room stilled. Even the clerk stopped typing. Then, another witness, the retired judge, Mr. Daniels, rose. He confirmed that the fund was legitimate, but the posthumous transfer had not been. A signature appeared after the man's passing, he said, voice firm. That is forgery, not philanthropy. I looked down at my hands. They didn't tremble. The judge, presiding, a woman younger than my daughter, read through the evidence in silence for nearly 10 minutes. You could hear every shuffle, every breath. Finally, she said, this court acknowledges Mrs. Hart's standing, her diligence, and her restraint. The Veteran Trust remains valid. The unlawful transfer is void. A modest bequest will be restored to Mrs. Hart in recognition of her role as caretaker and steward of the estate. Her gavel fell. No one clapped, but the quiet that followed was louder than any applause. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about truth standing up on its own 2 feet, quietly, finally, and publicly. Justice in small towns is often quiet, but it still rings true when it happens. When the judge read the verdict, the courtroom was so still I heard my own heart beating. Then my daughter grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. when you fight for something quietly, the return to peace feels strange at first. The mornings came slower again. Tea, toast, the familiar whistle of the kettle. The courthouse letters stopped. The phone stopped ringing with strangers' names. One afternoon, Ruth stopped by with flowers, wild daisies, simple and bright. "You did more than win," she said softly. "You cleared his name." The Veteran Trust reopened under its rightful structure. Funds directed to housing and care. My name appeared, not as a benefactor, but as guardian merit. I liked the sound of that quiet stewardship. And though my portion of the estate was modest, it came with something better than currency. Acknowledgement. A small note from the court clerk read, "For years of care, integrity, and testimony rendered with grace." I kept that line, not for pride, but for balance. My daughter began visiting more, not out of guilt, but understanding. We planted begonias together on the porch, side by side, saying little. Sometimes, silence heals what words can't. At church, people nodded again. The looks changed, not pity anymore, but respect. The little certainties of home returned. The kettle, the mail slot, the neighbor's wave, peace, rebuilt through simple repetitions. But the next morning, an envelope arrived with a photograph that would change the way I remembered Thomas altogether. The photograph was from years before I met him. Thomas in uniform, arms slung around another man's shoulders. The back read, "RM, always remember the promise." It made sense then, the initials, the trust, the letter. It wasn't betrayal, it was a promise kept too quietly. I sat at the kitchen table and smiled through tears. The man I thought had left me out had, in some way, written me in, not through money, but through meaning. That's the lesson, isn't it? We all leave something behind, sometimes a will, sometimes a trust, sometimes confusion, but what lasts longest are the intentions we keep too quietly. Don't let silence decide your worth. Let clarity preserve it. Write things down, ask questions while people can still answer them. Make your plans not to protect secrets, but to protect love. I tell you this because dignity isn't a gift someone gives you. It's something you keep for yourself through every conversation, every signed page, every hard truth faced with steady hands. So, talk to your families, keep your records, tell your stories before someone else writes them for you. Maybe what feels like a betrayal today is only an unfinished story, waiting for someone brave enough to turn the page. And maybe, in the end, the thing you thought was a betrayal is only an unfinished story. After the episode aired, the comments began like raindrops, soft, steady, growing. "Reminds me of my grandma. We've just talked to Mom about her will. For the first time, I forgave my father after watching this." People started forming small groups in town. Paperwork circles, they called them. They'd meet at libraries, coffee shops, church basements, talking not about gossip, but about dignity. Stories spread like light across porches and change how neighbors behave. In those comments, one woman wrote, "I found a letter my father never showed us." That one line made me pause. It made me reach for the phone. Months later, I hosted a small workshop at the town library, keeping family records. I brought cookies, old pens, and a smile. My son came early to set up chairs. He didn't say much, just hugged me a little longer than usual. The librarian introduced me as Mrs. Hart, who helped us all understand that paperwork can be love in disguise. We laughed, but it was true. The Veteran Trust now bore a plaque for Thomas. Nothing fancy, just his name and a single word beneath. Promise. Life felt quieter now, kinda. The kind of peace you don't announce, you just live inside it. I thought the story ended with a reading, but it kept unfolding, and we needed to learn the next steps. Next autumn, we'll plant the memorial rose in the park Thomas loved, and I'll tell one more story. Thank you for listening. Friends, if this story touched something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me one small document you'll prepare this week, or one conversation you'll finally have. Because every family owes itself a little planning and a lot of kindness. See you next video, for the quilt that kept a promise. For those who keep records, tell stories, and preserve dignity. Thank you for watching.